Our next speaker is Becky Neill. Becky serves as the Southern Hill Country Project Director for the Nature Conservancy in Texas. Her responsibilities include landowner, community, and volunteer outreach on and surrounding Love Creek Preserve and prescribed fire implementation across the state as part of TNC's fire crew. Please join me in welcoming Becky.
Thank you so much. I titled my presentation today, Connecting the Dots, Working at a Landscape Scale, One Ranch at a Time, because within the Conservancy, and I suspect it's like this for all of you out there and as practitioners, you're having the same conversations we are. How do we take the work that we're doing on our own projects and properties and expand that work and help really move that conservation needle? As you've heard, how do we ensure that these rare and unique species that we're finding in these areas have a place to continue to thrive and survive in an increasingly fragmented landscape? We're in Texas with, as we've heard, an incredible amount of private lands. One method just seems very obvious. It's just that we have to expand and improve upon our work with private landowners and outreach and engagement. So how can we do that? You've heard from a lot of great speakers already and more to come. I'm not sure I'm going to share anything groundbreaking or earth-shattering, but hopefully, as Steve Nelly so eloquently put, I'll give you something to ruminate on as you move forward and go home. So the landscape that I'm going to focus on today is, I'm not sure how universally the name is, but we call it in the Nature Conservancy the Bandera Canyonlands. It's in the northwest corner of Bandera County and the south central portion of the Edwards Plateau. The watersheds of the upper stretches of the Sabinal River and West Prong Medina River and all those little creeks and tributaries that feed into that serve as the boundary. You have lost maples up here, and as Jason mentioned, there's just a ton of rare, unique plant species, and TNC long recognized it, as did others, as just an ecological hotspot, and they've always had an interest in working more and being more involved in this area. So how do we do that? I have just a bit of trivia for you. How many of you can name the town that is known as the apple capital of Texas? Shout it out. Medina! Ding, 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 ding. So if you've heard of Medina, this couple is one of the couples, Baxter and Carol Adam, who you have to thank for that. They were instrumental in getting the apple industry started in this part of the country. It started with a few apple trees on their ranch that they bought in the early 1980s. They recognized that it wasn't great cattle country, so in figuring out ways to utilize the property, they stumbled onto or came upon growing apples. Started with a few trees, grew into multiple orchards. If you have ever had a cheeseburger and apple ice cream at this apple cafe, you can thank them. So it really, they lived in this area, they had the ranch, and were very instrumental in the community. But as they got older and into the later 1990s, they started to think about ways to downsize their responsibilities. And at that time, they had approached the Conservancy to see if the Conservancy, would be interested in buying their ranch. And so the Conservancy sent some biologists out to do some initial preliminary surveys, and they were overwhelmed with what they found on the ranch. It had been very conscientiously and conservation-minded management from the Adams, and they found everything that one would expect to find and more on a hill country property. So it was just a great representation. And the Adams also, in addition to growing apples, they started growing big tooth maples or lost maples. So if you see them growing in someone's yard, they likely originated from this ranch at some point. So in April of 2000, the Nature Conservancy successfully acquired 1,400 acres of what was once the approximately 1,830 acre Love Creek Ranch from the Adams. This was the more raw, undeveloped portion of the ranch. It was sold to the Conservancy by the Adams at a bargain sale. So there was a donation component on the side of the Adams. And we started looking at ways of doing management on this. Now we had some skin in the game in this area. And so one of my coworkers, Brandon Crawford, our boss, Dan Snodgrass, they started going out and doing some management. And we also looked at ways to, having Lost Maples and Love Creek serving as sort of bookends. How could we tie these two together? How could we increase the conservation that was happening in the area? So there were a lot of DNC folks and others working in the area, and I'll miss some if I try and name them all, but two that I'll highlight are Bill Carr and Paul Barwick. Paul worked very closely with the Adams and was instrumental in helping to help us acquire Love Creek, and he started doing some early landowner outreach in the area. And Bill Carr, who Jason mentioned, botanist extraordinaire, he was roaming the hills and doing botanical surveys, meeting with landowners, and helping them gain a better appreciation for what they had on a landscape. I know if I can put a name with that little tiny discrete plant that maybe I've walked past 100 times and never paid any attention to, suddenly with a name, it has a lot more meaning, and I start looking for it elsewhere. And so that's what Bill really helped to do, and Paul joined him, and a number of other folks were starting to do surveys as well. I redacted the names of these ranches just for privacy purposes, but they will come into play later. Two, again, that I'll highlight, are Rock Chimney Ranch and the Bierschwell Tract, because just as a reminder, this is where we were in April of 2000. And as we fast forward now to 2024, this is what the preserve looks like today. We went from 1,400 acres to now more than double that at 2,885 acres, and that was through a series of acquisitions over the years. There's a lot of different funding sources. There's a lot more detail that you can go into to cover the story of this, but 3 of these properties were acquired using funding from Section 6 grants through U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for endangered species habitat protection. That Rock Chimney Ranch that Bill did some early survey work on, that was one of the tracts from that ranch as it was being sold that we were able to acquire. We call this the Freeze Tract. It was the name of the previous owner. We purchased this again with Section 6 funding in 2015. It gave us a portion of the Clark Creek live water frontage. And then most recently, it's hard to see, but December 2023, so just before Christmas this past year, we closed on this 377 acre, what we call the Horatio Tract again for the previous owner. So it's been really exciting to piece this together, and there's a lot of landowner networking and connections that have been made over the years that have helped lead into these acquisitions. This other property, this was a mitigation deal that was done with a lot of partners, but a developer out of San Antonio in the Dominion area. He recognized that he was going to impact warbler habitat on his development, and he went through the proper channels, contacted the right people, and went about it the correct way, and was able to secure the credits he needed to do his work. And it also led to us adding an extra 223 acres to our property, which was really cool. This little property here, I say little, sorry, I don't mean to demean it in size. This was a particularly fun property for me, both personally and professionally. And it's a great story of landowner relationship building. My colleague, David Bezanson, who was employed by a different land trust at the time, back in the early 2000s when it's the Tush family, Bob and Dee Tush, purchased their ranch, worked with David to put a conservation easement on their property. They wanted to make sure it was protected into the future. They had the idea one day that they would donate it, although they didn't know at the time who that would be to. David helped him secure the easement. He then transferred over to TNC. I came on board when we started looking at adding these couple properties in '09, so I got into the area. And then in 2013, they made an outright donation to the Conservancy of this property. And that allowed me to actually move out and live on this property, which was pretty cool. Professionally, it was a huge advantage because I became not just a visitor to the community, I became an actual member of the community and a neighbor to these landowners. So I wasn't just the gal driving the white Tacoma pulling in every now and then and waving as I went by, but it allowed, the opportunity to get to know and really understand the land better and the dynamics of the community. So now that we have this chunk of land, it is a lot to manage because of our funding, because of the habitat types that we have on the property. A lot of our management is centered around the golden cheek warbler or the black-capped vireo and how we best manage those habitats. Not only for those two species, they get a lot of the attention, especially because of the funding we received for purchasing this land, but also the whole suite of the native plants and endemics that live here. It's really interesting to go back on the historic aerial photos because you can see kind of the history and progression of land use and land change and clearing over time. And you can tell just even on the preserve, these different tracts, you can kind of separate the ownership based on the level of clearing that's taken place. So we're taking a look at what's on the property now, kind of what was done, and what our goal and vision is moving forward. And so we're not looking to do a whole lot of extensive clearing at this time, but we are trying to pay attention to some of these areas that were historically cleared and more open and make great habitat for the vireo. So we center our habitat work around the vireos, more in our uplands and some of those bottomland areas where it's more open and shrubby, and in these drainages and canyons, steeper areas, we're leaving more for the warbler. And several of the tools that we're using, call it selective brush clearing. Our motto is more take some, leave some. We're not looking to clear cut it. We're looking to improve upon, and just as Charlotte had mentioned, this vireo habitat is a very successional state of habitat. So periodically it needs to be reset, whether it's through brush clearing or other methods. We've been able to get funding from different sources over the years that helped us to do some larger scale mechanical clearing on areas where there was a little bit more brushwork that we needed to be done. More recently, we've been able to get by with doing, by hand with chainsaws or getting volunteers out on the property to do lopper work. We used to have a volunteer day called Lopperpalooza. Bring your loppers and go to town cutting those little junipers. Some of the areas, like I mentioned, we're focusing on managing for the vireo. It's more these upland areas. We've cleared approximately 400 acres, and a lot of that is, repeat acreage, not new acreage. Some of the larger scales were through those grants. One thing I will caution, if you're advising landowners or doing work yourself, if you get grant funding, which it's always nice to get funding to help you with your work, just be aware of the deliverables and the expectations of the program, because some of them may not align with what your vision is, with what the deliverables are. They may require more clearing or less clearing than what you're looking to be done. So just one thing to be cautious of. A lot of the clearing now that we do is just in pockets here and there as we're trying to kind of keep our area. We're aiming for diversity. And we also hope that by being land managers ourselves in this area, we can be a resource as neighbors see what's going on. It opens those lines of communication. They see us using those same tools. They see us running a saw, or they see us going into the saw shop to get our saw repaired or buy some extra chains or bar oils or whatever. And that just leads to conversation about what's going on your property, and sharing war stories or lessons learned about, man, I did this and it didn't work out so great, but I did it this way and it was awesome. And we learn from them as well on what works and doesn't work. Another tool that we like to use, my personal favorite, prescribed fire. This is some of our mechanical work, and our clearing has really just paved the way for being able to use fire now moving forward as more of our primary tool for management. It's a lot more economical than having to pay for a larger scale mechanical clearing effort. We usually work off of 2 tracks and roads, and then we're burning into natural fire breaks, which may sound a little bit willy-nilly, but I assure you there is much planning that goes into all of these burns before the match is ever lit. But we're not using a natural method of, ignition, but we're hoping that this is a more natural way of letting nature kind of do its course. And we call them mosaic burns in the hill country. Our fuels are pretty fragmented, so it'll burn great and then it'll go out. And when it goes up into those denser juniper canopies where there's less fuel underneath, you may get some torching along the edge, but by and large it's going to go out, or it might skunk around, but ultimately it's going to go out because we're not burning under apocalyptic conditions where it's going to just take off and get into the canopy and go racing over the hills. We're burning under generally milder conditions. And over the years, we have burned just over 1,000 acres. Again, it's a lot of repeat. This map is a little outdated. We just burned all of this and this little pocket in February of 24, or 23, excuse me. No, 24, we're in 24. But that acreage is included. So this is the 3rd time. And this was pretty cool because when we bought it, we have the luxury of managing the property not for having to make a profit off of it. A lot of the landowners historically may have been trying to produce some kind of an income, or that was their livelihood. So their management is going to look different than us, where we're managing it for wildlife and don't have to have a production aspect on it to, help cover the bills. So this was a little bit more grazed. It was grazed a little heavier. There wasn't as much fuel. But as we've been able to let it rest over time, this was actually the 3rd burn that we did in this area. A lot of these areas were predominantly KR blue stem dominated, as much of our grassland systems are. And anecdotally, we've seen pockets of native plants popping up. I appreciated the talk yesterday where cool season, warm season, growing season, it doesn't necessarily make that much of a difference. It's all positive, so yay. It's a lot harder to burn for us in a growing season burn with burn bans and everything else, but anecdotally we are seeing some changes. And our fire return interval's around 4 to 7 years, and that's obviously dependent on what kind of weather we're seeing. If we're in the middle of a drought and we're not growing much fuel, it's going to be a longer time period. But we like to try and send some smoke into the air every year, just so that it gets people comfortable with seeing it. It gets them to know and recognize it. Oh, they're burning on the preserve again, or they're burning on the Conservancy again, whatever the case may be. And some of those calls, we do courtesy calls before we do any burn, because it does make people nervous to see smoke, understandably, and we want to make them as comfortable as we can. And it went from early calls back in 2009 when we did our first burn of, oh, are you sure you want to burn today? It's pretty sketchy, to now when we call, oh, maybe I'll stop by. That sounds great. I'd like to come and see. 1? Okay. Sorry. So it's just getting used to that idea that smoke is okay, and done under right conditions, it can be very beneficial. And so other ways that we've found to connect, I appreciated your talk just before, is building those partnerships, finding that common ground, because everybody is motivated by their own set of interests and values that they place on the land, and it's just getting information out there. There's a group in the area called the Bandera Canyonlands Alliance. It's a landowner-based group. They started in early 2000. It was kind of loosely organized then. It's grown to a full-fledged 501c3 nonprofit organization, and they have an annual meeting, and we've started hosting it out at the preserve back in around 2015. And it's a great way to gather neighbors, friends, landowners from all different backgrounds, all different interests. We usually have a speaker on whatever the topic of interest is that year. And then we have other professionals that set up tables with other information that the landowners can go and check out as they're milling around as well. There's a band, and we feed them barbecue. Who doesn't like to eat? So it's a great way just to connect in that way. And then another way, I mentioned surveys, the botanical surveys that Bill Card did. Charlotte does a lot of them now, moving forward. And we also started a Christmas bird count and a North American Butterfly Association count. And you can see the Christmas bird count circle almost perfectly aligns with our Bandera Canyon lands and includes all of these ranches in between. And then the butterfly count, we shifted to the east to include a little native plant nursery where we get a lot of butterfly activity. But over the years, it's grown from having just a handful of landowners plus, you know, the preserve to now our representation in that is almost 21,000 acres that are held by other landowners that are allowing us to do surveys through this Christmas bird count. And when a landowner gives you their gate combo, that's a major sign of trust that we don't take for granted. So when they're allowing us to come out and send volunteers out, it's a really cool way to connect with them. We get valuable information that we send to Audubon. We learn more about the property and the landscape, but the landowner comes away with, we send them the bird list for their property, and they come away also with a better understanding of what's out there. And over time, they can see changes or, oh, that was a new bird that I hadn't seen or something. And same with the butterfly count.
You need to wrap it up.
Yep, okay, sorry. So this is just a reminder where we came from, and this is today. So all of these green are easements that the Conservancy holds. The orange ones are held by other entities and partners, and my focus was TNC-centric, but this map shows that there's a lot of work going on by a lot of different partners and people, and everybody doing their part, making those connections really can help move the conservation needle by connecting those landscapes. So that's all I have.